We are continuing to remove some of the paywalls and updating some of the content for this the second year of Phroneo. Please enjoy this post originally published here a year ago and share it with your friends and relations. We are not free, that is, most of us. Has not man a hard service upon earth, and are not his days like the days of a hireling, like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like a hireling who looks for his wages? So I am allotted months of emptiness, and nights of misery are apportioned to me. Job, chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. In the Orthodox Church, as in most other Christian traditions, there seems to be a list of commandments or rules that is often seen, at least implicitly, as obligatory for most. Thou shalt pray, thou shalt fast, and thou shalt attend church services are some of these imperatives. They are taken so much for granted that it is rarely, if ever, elaborated who specifically is expected to obey these precepts, or to what extent, or where exactly did these rules originate. There is an undeniable scriptural basis for these rules, but its translation into the modern practice is not always straightforward. Fervently did the apostles pray, but not one of them ever owned a Jordanville or St. Tikhon's prayer book. Fast they did, but none ever knew that fish was allowed on some days, wine and oil on others, and tofu on most of the rest. And it is not self-evident that those of us who know with precision on which days shrimp is allowed are any better for it than the apostles or their flock, who were largely ignorant of such technicalities. They celebrated the Eucharist, but the question of whether to leave right after the anointing, or to skip the hours, or to bring their children to just right before communion never entered their pious minds. In the context of Orthodox canons, at least with respect to fasting, the general rule is that all should fast. See, for example, Apostolic Canon 69, 4th century. And as far as I can tell, most faithful understand this and similar rules to be such and feel guilty to one degree or another if not observing them, and regularly confess something like not fasting enough, or not praying enough, or not going to church enough. I have little doubt that people genuinely feel sorry for these perceived failures. On the other hand, there exists a multitude of exceptions from these rules and dispensations for a large number of circumstances. For example, a child who depends on his parents for transportation is quite obviously blameless in failing to attend all church services or to arrive on time. Similarly, the same may not have complete independence in matters of cooking and consuming food. An older child may be gently encouraged to non-demonstratively abstain from desserts or to limit amounts of certain foods if his family chooses not to fast, but it is generally understood that the child is not independent, and that any conflict between the child and his parents in such matters is best to be avoided. Canonically, dispensations from fasting are given to women after childbirth and to the ill. See the canons of St. Timothy of Alexandria, 8 and 10, respectively. Thus, at least by the end of the 4th century, there existed a general principle that if the body has been humbled in some way, whether through childbirth or sickness, that fasting was not necessary, and the afflicted person ought to partake of as much as he or she may wish, and ought to be released and to be allowed to partake of food and drink. Canons 8 and 10, respectively. Naturally, a derivation of a general principle prompts its application in other situations, not specifically addressed, but conforming to the condition of the body being humbled. For example, hard physical labor, strenuous exercise, and old age are all conditions that humble the body. The same logic can be applied even further. Famously, students and faculty at the Moscow Theological Academy and Seminary are allowed to eat fish during Lent. The clarity of the Typicon in this matter notwithstanding, presumably because studies in theology humble the brain, and fish contains omega-3 fatty acids, which are beneficial to the brain. Some students at another seminary, which shall not be named here, are said to partake in a tradition of going out for pizza on Fridays. The reasoning is that the students who are not monastics eat at the monastery's dining hall all week and are thus forced to fast. Friday night, then, is their make-up meal for the feasting they missed during the week. Sum cuique. Precepts of Orthodox praxis are highly dependent on one's life's circumstances, and perhaps the most constraining circumstance is on one's time, when one's time belongs not to him, but to someone else. The most obvious example is that of slavery. It is not that slaves in times past could not attend Christian services. For example, they could, and did, both in ancient Rome and in the not-so-ancient United States, but that their masters could prevent them from attending should they choose to. Ordinarily, slaves had to perform work for their masters before they would be free to join their fellow Christians in celebrating the Eucharist. In fact, obedience to the earthly masters was not seen as lamentable or to be suffered begrudgingly, but elevated to the spiritual level of obedience to the Lord. See Ephesians 6 verse 5, Colossians 3 verses 22 through 25, et passim. Thus, for slaves, service to Christ may be rendered not only through feeding the hungry or visiting the sick, see Matthew 25 verse 35 through 36, but likewise through entire and true fidelity to their masters with all respect. 1 Peter 2 verse 18. For their part, masters allowed, if not actively encouraged, their slaves to practice the vast variety of religious traditions in the Roman Empire, including Christianity, at least in its earliest decades, at all levels, to include serving as elders and priests. However, the Apostolic Constitution's 882 stipulates that slaves should not be ordained into the clergy without their master's consent, which was to be expressed by the masters granting freedom to the slaves worthy of ordination. This was not due to racism or prejudice against slaves as persons, a very interesting topic to explore in a future post, but due to the nature of a slave's occupation in a very literal sense of this word. The slaves' obligations to their masters evidently were incompatible with taking on clerical obligations to the early church. Even freedmen, those who were freed unrelated and prior to being considered for clerical ordination, continued to be under obligations to their former masters, and thus ineligible for holy orders, according to the Synod of Elvira, Canon 80. Compare this to the Apostolic Canon 6, which forbids clergy from undertaking worldly business in general, presumably because worldly considerations and obligations would inevitably come into conflict with service at the altar, even if in no other way but by taking up one's time, the most limited of all resources. While at the present time in the West, we do not consider ourselves to be slaves, and slavery as an institution no longer exists, At least in the West, very few people are independently wealthy, belong to the idle class, or are gentlemen farmers. Most of us are forced to work by the circumstances of our birth and life. We hire ourselves out to employers and receive compensation for a portion of our life, at least a quarter of our life, 40 hours every week, or 5 out of every 20 years, does not belong to us. Theoretically, we can quit a job, but very few of us are in the position to not immediately seek another. Most of us, hopefully, do not feel dehumanized by our employers, but it would be an equal mistake to think that the employers consider us as persons or individuals. In a technical sense, we are a resource, a human resource. When a company needs workers, it does not need you specifically or any other individual, but rather bodies in general, albeit with certain skills or aptitudes. If a human can be replaced by automation, then employers readily do that, thus highlighting the fact that for them, a human is merely a thing that performs certain tasks, which can be just as well performed by another thing. In order to acquire human resources, companies enter the so-called labor market, a marketplace where humans sell themselves or are sold by staffing agencies. This is in no way a comment on human rights, opportunities, or individual situations of specific people, but only to point out that the forces that in the past set prices for commodities at slave markets may be quite similar to the ones that today set wages at markets of human resources. Slaving away at their job is still something many people feel that they do. Notably, the Russian word for job, just as the Greek one, has the root slave, and the English word slave comes from Slav. So many Slavic people were enslaved in the Middle Ages that the very word for their ethnicity became to mean slave. It must be noted that any moral parallels between slavery, especially some of the worst kinds of slavery and the atrocities committed by the worst slavers, and modern-day employment cannot be truly made. This may not have been the case 100 years ago, but employees today have many rights, protections, benefits, and can bring lawsuits against employers who violate these rights. Clearly, this is a very different situation from a slave who is treated as a farm implement rather than a human. Thus, this conversation is not about any moral equivalency between these phenomena, but about the practical implications of not being fully in possession of one's time, whether as a slave in the Roman Empire or an employee of a corporation in the United States. The considerations that were relevant in the first few centuries of Christianity may be just as relevant today, quite apart from any discussion of the moral aspects of slavery in late antiquity or the particulars of the present-day capitalist treatment of humans as resources to be exploited. For example, St. John Chrysostom complained in the 4th century that men were unable to attend divine services during the day. Apparently, women did not have the same problem. His most skillful exhortations had no effect because men were simply unavailable. In order to get men to come to church, St. John instituted midnight services and vigils, certainly not frequent on account of the necessity of sleep, which men were then able to attend. The situation is not much different in the 21st century, except nowadays both men and women are forced to sell large portions of their time on the labor market. Additionally, most of us no longer attend services in our traditional parish churches. Often people have a lengthy commute just to get to a church. Thus, a 2-hour-long church service can in reality mean a 4 to 4.5 hour-long trip. If this sample family is able to attend both the Saturday evening service and the Sunday liturgy, as is the case in the Russian tradition, this is an 8-hour-long commitment in total. Add to this morning and evening prayer, the pre-communion prayer rule, Sunday school for children, a choir practice, and the total time spent on a weekend in prayer, in church, or on the way to church can easily add up to 12 hours or more. Of course, some people are able to do this, and those who do not are often urged by their parish priests to pull themselves up and to get more engaged in the life of the parish. Sometimes, the exhortations of pastors today have as much effect as those of St. John 16 centuries ago. People are simply not available, no matter how Chriso our stoma may be. Time is the most limited resource in most people's lives, and the competition is not between church and work, but between church and time away from work. Time with children, time with family, rest, hobbies, etc. In other words, people are free to compromise on attending church services, even for great feasts, if they must. We have not excommunicated anyone for missing church in many centuries. They are also free to compromise on how much time they spend with their spouse or children. The dubious wisdom of such compromises notwithstanding, they are even free to neglect their own physiological needs of sleep or healthy meals, but they are not free to compromise on their work. Their employer demands a certain exact portion of their life and will not be satisfied with less. In an apparent recognition that most faithful serve earthly masters who will not alter their scheduled demands, some Orthodox jurisdictions have adjusted theirs. It is not uncommon that in some churches no services of any kind are scheduled on Saturdays, which lessens the total weekly time commitment. If matins are served on Sundays before liturgy, most people, even the choir, are not expected to attend. It is not clear that anyone has ever worked out the liturgical and theological implications of such arrangements. For example, if the Orthros service, Orthros Utrinia, is not meant to gather the community, or the community is unwilling or unable to gather for it, then what is its purpose? If it is offered for the benefit of the clergy, then does this lead to clericalization, a phenomenon as pernicious as it seems to be ubiquitous to one degree or another? These questions deserve further exploration in a future post. Another attempt to ensure, as Leo Tolstoy might have put it, that the wolves are fed and the sheep kept safe, is the practice of moving church feasts to the nearest Sunday, since people are not free to attend celebrations during the week. To be sure, it is usually noted by those who do this that they do not move the feast itself, but only its celebration. This seems to be a distinction without a difference. If, for example, the Church New Year were marked not on September 1st, or 14th as it were, but with special prayers on the Sunday closest to the full moon, preceding Rosh Hashanah, this might not only be preferable to moving these prayers to January 1st, as many now do, but people would likely soon forget the connection of this holiday to the tax policy of the Byzantine Empire and view it primarily as a celebration of the creation of the world. Lex orandi, lex credendi. Unlike the situation with Vespers and Matins, which seems far less coherent, the practice of moving church feasts or their celebrations, please allow me to correct myself, to the days when people can actually attend these celebrations may be not only reasonable, but also, in principle, it follows the example set by St. John Chrysostom, as was mentioned above. Finally, albeit not exhaustively, it seems important to briefly discuss private prayer. While there is not a specific rule that mandates that the morning and evening prayers or the pre-communion prayers be recited in the form in which they are found in modern prayer books, the very existence of these books implies the existence of a standard or a rule, canon, to which one, at the very least, should aspire. This is so much so that many people who at confession speak of not praying enough usually mean that they either habitually shorten the rule as it is printed in the book or forgo it altogether. The morning and evening prayer rules, as they are printed in a standard prayer book, are not particularly lengthy or time-consuming, 15 or 20 minutes each, if recited in an unhurried manner. Regularly completing these prayers is mostly a matter of habit, rather than any serious time commitment. And yet, many people still do not pray enough. Curiously, the morning and evening prayer rules come to us not from blessed antiquity, but through monastic traditions from approximately the 17th century, and did not spread widely among the laity until some time later. How people prayed in the 16th century is hardly any more relevant here than how they prayed in the 12th or 6th centuries. But as an example, there existed a tradition of reciting the small compline in the evening and the midnight office in the morning. At least this tradition existed among those who could recite these services and had access to the horologion. Whether a discipline like this should be considered obligatory for literate laity is a discussion for another time, but whatever the arguments, they are not likely to be effective in addressing the issue of not praying enough by simply replacing one set of prayers with another. However, there exists another, much earlier tradition, which does indeed come to us from antiquity. In the Didache, an early Christian document that is usually dated to the 1st century, the daily prayer rule is described as reciting the Lord's Prayer 3 times per day. Tristis imeras uto prosevcheste. No specific times are mentioned in the text, but the natural divisions of the waking hours of our lives into morning, noonday, and evening may make a good practice. Certainly, there is nothing here to suggest that adding extra prayers by Saint Macarios or Saint John of Damascus to one's daily rule is not pious, but likewise, nothing seems to suggest that reciting the single prayer given to us by the Lord Himself is insufficient to accomplish whatever one aims to accomplish by praying, or that the Church in the 1st century lacked the creative gift to compose more prayers, had she found them necessary. The Didache does not now, and perhaps never did, constitute a general rule for all Christians to follow, but arguably neither does any modern edition of the prayer book. However, the simple rule of praying the Lord's Prayer 3 times each day may be a very good beginning indeed, and a sustainable lifelong practice for those who presently find themselves not praying enough. The reason I brought up this very short prayer rule, consisting of only one prayer, is twofold. On the one hand, there is a joke that the Roman mindset asks what else it can subtract and still get away with, while the Byzantine mindset asks what else it can add and still get away with. The collections of prayers that now make up the evening and morning prayer rules did not start out consisting of 10, 11, 12, or more prayers. They were much shorter and grew over the past 300 years, and even over the past 100 years. They also continue to grow as other pious prayers are added. The spiritual treasure of the Church is not shrinking, it is steadily growing as time goes by. Once something is added, the Orthodox mindset is extremely reluctant to remove it. Shortening a prayer rule feels like a bad thing to do. Thus, one ends up confessing the sin of not praying enough. On the other hand, I have not noticed that many people who confess not praying enough are lazy or neglectful about their spiritual lives. This is not to say that there are no lazy and neglectful people, but those usually neither come to church nor confess a lack of prayer. Typically, pastors work with people who do come to church, who do come to confession, who clean, cook, donate, sing, bring their children to Sunday school, help others, and all of that in addition to raising those children while working a full-time job and attempting to manage a relationship with a spouse. These are not lazy people. Suggesting to them that they should wake up 15 minutes earlier in order to fit in morning prayers or the midnight office is not very helpful when they only get 5 or 6 hours of sleep per night. The elders of Optina, whose prayer is nowadays sometimes added to the daily prayer rules, making it longer still, often said that obedience is greater than prayer and fasting. Perhaps apostolic passages that urge obedience to earthly masters as unto the Lord, see Ephesians 6 verse 5 for example, should include obedience to employers as a form of service to God. If the lifting up of one's hands in prayer is a sacrifice to God, Psalm 141 verse 2, then working for human masters, if done with sincerity of heart and reverence, can be seen as working for the Lord, see Colossians 2 verse 22 through 25, or as an acceptable sacrifice to God. This is not to say that a morning prayer rule could or should be replaced with a good attitude in the office, but perhaps this is to say that just a little bit. Just as a woman will be saved through bearing children, 1 Timothy 2 verse 15, an unmistakable reference to the epithemia or penance imposed by God in the garden, Genesis 3 verse 16. Perhaps a man is saved through toil in the sweat of his brow, verses 17 through 19. Thus, rather than lamenting our bondage to our employers or seeing secular employment as an obstacle to proper prayer, should we not see this as a form of medicine that God offered for our salvation? And rather than creating and deepening a separation between the sacred and the profane, the church and the world, should we not attempt to sanctify the world to bring it into the sacred? Perhaps honestly and faithfully fulfilling one's obedience at work as unto the Lord can be understood to be, if not above, then at least not in opposition to fasting and prayer. I do not suggest that those who hold a job need not bother with prayer, or that an adequate preparation for receiving communion consists of toiling at mowing the lawn on a hot day and thus getting one's brow all sweaty. But perhaps the beauty of the largely monastic tradition of lengthy and ever-increasing prayer rules, daily cycles consisting of 8, 9, or more divine services, and obedience to an abbot, could also shine upon a layman's labors to feed his family as incense that rises before God, a woman's toil to care for her children as an evening sacrifice, sleepless nights of young parents as their midnight office, and all other secular bonds that lay people humbly bear in patience because they are conscious of God as a spiritual obedience, which, as some say, after all, is greater than prayer and fasting. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this post, please share it with your friends and relations. And if you are choosing to spend precious time reading Phroneo, please consider becoming a paying subscriber. It is only $5 per month and clearly worth every penny.